I thought for a few minutes this morning we would just have a look at Bartimaeus and look at the account of Bartimaeus and the restoring of his sight that Jesus performed. Now, we've heard the account many, many times before. It's in Matthew's Gospel, it's in Mark's Gospel, it's in Luke's Gospel. They're all slightly different. In Matthew's Gospel, there are two blind men who are healed of their sight. In Luke's Gospel, there is just one, but he's not named. It's only Mark that actually names the individual concerned. And it's a passage that I've heard preached on probably not the most number of times, but a lot of times, a quite high number of occasions. And it usually talks about the power of God as Jesus used it to cure Bartimaeus, but the power of God that is available to us for us to use on ourselves and to use on other people. But today I'd just like to do something a little bit different. I'd like to look at Bartimaeus and look at it from his point of view. Now, I know that we don't know much about Bartimaeus, but we just want to have a look to see how, from what we know and from what we can surmise, how did he react? What difference did it make to him? And as I say, all we really know about him is what is in Mark's Gospel. The other Gospels don't really add anything to it. Let me paint a picture of Bartimaeus and the effect that day had on him. And let us see how I can apply it to my own life and perhaps how it applies to yours. Jesus had been teaching, talking, healing now for 3 years. He had collected a large number of followers. And he was heading towards Jerusalem. He was heading towards his death on that cross. If we carried on reading past verse 52, we would have got into chapter 11. And chapter 11 of Mark's Gospel is Jesus entering Jerusalem and the crowds waving the palms and shouting Hosanna. On the day that we call Palm Sunday, 2 weeks before Easter. Now here we are, 62 days till Christmas. Sorry, I shouldn't have mentioned that, should I? Thinking about an event that happened March, April time in our calendar. But the timing doesn't matter. I'm only mentioning that because Jesus was at his most popular. He'd got his most followers. This was the time when he was entering Jerusalem triumphant. And Jesus and his disciples, as I say, were on their way to Jerusalem, and they'd reached Jericho. And the excitement of the crowd was growing. They had watched all the events surrounding Jesus, and there was an air of expectation. The crowd were pushing and shoving. And Jesus walked on, talking to people, healing them, reassuring them. And that's one of the reasons why we get one account, one incident, and 3 different accounts. Because it was so confusing that not everybody saw everything. In the crush, Jesus healed 2 blind men, as recorded in Matthew. And no more is said of them. But I suspect that Bartimaeus was one of those 2. It wasn't a separate incident. And I suspect that Bartimaeus kept in touch with some of the disciples. And later got in touch with Mark, so that the story would be included in his gospel. If this had just been a blind man at the side of the road, nothing more would have been recorded. So I like to think that Bartimaeus stayed in touch. We know that, according to the account, he followed Jesus, that he stayed in touch. That not only did Jesus cure his blindness, but changed his life. But that is not in the gospel. What is in the gospel is pure and simple. A blind beggar, Bartimaeus, was sitting at the roadside, heard Jesus was passing by, called out to Jesus. Jesus heard him and called him over, and Jesus asked Bartimaeus what he wanted. And Bartimaeus only wanted one thing, his sight back. And Jesus healed him, and he was followed by Bartimaeus on the road. But what about Bartimaeus? What about him? We know that he was blind. We know that he was begging at the side of the road. We know he wanted his sight restored. But was he blind from very early in his life? Was he suddenly struck with blindness? Did he have a family? I'm a trustee of one of the Scottish health charities, it's not a very well-known one, that support people with a particular medical condition, which can, if not caught in time, cause people to go blind. And I've got a friend of mine from Edinburgh who went to accident and emergency one Friday afternoon. I've got a pain in my temple up here. Oh, this is important. Can you come back on Monday morning? She came back on Monday morning, blind in one eye, untreatable. Her life changed over that weekend. She'd still got sight in one eye, but it had affected her greatly. If Bartimaeus had had a similar experience, then he may well have had a family who he'd been supporting, a family who he'd been providing for, and suddenly he couldn't. It wasn't just the blindness that was the problem here. Eventually he'd find a place to sit at the roadside and beg from the people who were entering and leaving Jericho. He would be helped probably to get from his home to the side of the road and help back again. And very gradually, he'd manage to make make enough money begging to support himself. And he would then rely on the generosity of others. I think we have to assume that Bartimaeus had heard about Jesus. Possibly he'd listened to him. Possibly he'd seen him, but you know what I mean. He'd been in the same area as him. Had even talked to him. But Bartimaeus knew about Jesus. He knew about the miracles. He knew about the feeding of the crowds. He knew about the healings, and possibly even knew about Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. Bartimaeus would think about these accounts. He would think of the possibility of him being cured, having his sight restored. And on the face of it, it was a straightforward decision. In those times, though, begging was well supported. And if he got his sight back, he'd have to work. So did he weigh up those possibilities? Stay blind and have money coming in from his begging? Or ask Jesus to restore him and have a different sort of uncertainty, having to face finding work? He would know that even if he saw Jesus, there was no certainty that he would get his sight back. And then that moment came. He called out to Jesus, and Jesus called back and asked him what he wanted. And at that stage, Bartimaeus expressed that faith that he had in Jesus. Rabbi, I want my sight back. He could have asked for money, and he would have received it. But he believed in Jesus. He believed in his power, and he believed that Jesus could and would heal him. And Jesus recognized the faith that Bartimaeus had, because he said, go, your faith has healed you. Go, your faith has healed you. Didn't just heal him. He recognized that Bartimaeus was somebody who believed in him. Bartimaeus had faith. We don't know how deep, but he had faith. But what did he do next? Well, we know that he followed Jesus on the road. He could have gone home. He could have told his family, his neighbours, his friends. He could have arranged a party. But he didn't. He followed Jesus. And we don't know what happened to him. Did he stay with Jesus all the way down to Jerusalem? Was he one of the ones cutting the palms? Was he even in the crowd when Peter spoke of that first Pentecost? We just don't know. But I like to think that because that detail about him is in the gospel, that his life was turned round, it was changed. He would have told lots of people about his healing anyway. You can imagine it, can't you? The equivalent of these days, meeting somebody in the street and saying, do you know what happened to me down at Jericho? I was sitting at the side of the road, and you can imagine the story. And he would repeat it to everybody because it was such good news. I like to think that he stayed in touch, that he became part of the early church. And that is why Mark, when he wrote his gospel, was able to put Bartimaeus was at the side of the road. But what do I learn from this story about Bartimaeus, which, as I say, I have elaborated, if you like? Bartimaeus had faith. Bartimaeus had a faith that Jesus recognized. Bartimaeus made decisions based on that faith. Bartimaeus took risks to publicly acknowledge that faith. How strong is our faith? Is our faith a 1 hour on a Sunday? Is our faith an insurance policy that if things go wrong in our life, we can call on somebody? Bartimaeus risked losing his support at the town gate or the roadside and finding work to support himself. He risked looking foolish by asking Jesus to heal him. Do we take risks for our faith? When I was thinking about this, I went back in my life. I went back to Sunday mornings when I used to have a dog who's passed away now. Out walking the dog on a Sunday morning, people would say to me, "What are you doing today?" Now, the first and most important thing for me was to go to church. Was that what I told people? No. It would be, I've got to travel to wherever I was going for the following week, or I'm going to dig the garden, or whatever. How many seeds would I have planted over the years by just saying, I'm going to church? Because we had a person came round to fit some curtains. And he said, I think it must have been a Friday, he said, "What have you got on at the weekend?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to church on Sunday." And they started a conversation. And I know this person reasonably well, and he seemed genuinely interested. Now, whether it's anything's come of it, I don't know. That's not my problem, that's God's problem. My dad, rest his soul, said to me on a number of occasions, polite people never talk, about politics and religion. Well, I'm sorry, Dad. The politics I can accept. The religion I disagree. It's the only thing I disagree with my dad or disagreed with my dad about. How many seeds can we plant in other people? And it's not about getting numbers into the church. That's got nothing to do with it. It's about changing their lives. They're missing a great opportunity. And how many people have I missed over the course of my years? How many could I have said something? I'm not suggesting I ram it down their throat. And there's a story told of a lady who passed away. And at her funeral, one of the men in her office said, I knew there was something special about her. I just didn't know what it was until today. He didn't know she was a Christian. He saw the effects, but he didn't know. And I found that a shame, because how much more progress would he have made if he'd known what it was that was the influence in her life? We don't know. We worry about it. We shouldn't, because all we're doing is offering the opportunity. The rest is in God's hands. Amen.